my entire life, I've heard stories about the 4 years my parents spent in Lukachukai, Arizona. From 1978 to 1982, my parents taught at the boarding school on the Navajo, or Diné, Reservation. Growing up, I've always had an appreciation for the Navajo culture. Our house is full of Navajo artwork that my parents collected from their friends and neighbors. There are paintings and rugs and ceramics all over the house. I loved hearing their stories about the Navajo. I loved learning about the people they met. They had such a meaningful time there at the reservation, and it was so interesting to me to hear about how they created a life there and were accepted into the community. For the first year, my dad taught art to all the grades at the school, which is kindergarten through 6th grade. My mom hadn't been hired yet, so she spent that first year taking weaving classes from a Navajo woman at the Diné College. After that first year ended, my dad taught 2nd grade, and my mom got hired as the kindergarten teacher. One of my favorite stories I heard was about the times my parents made floats for the Native Americans' Day parades. In 1981, my mom and her kindergarten class sat on a float that was decorated with weavings that she made and a teepee she painted. The next year, my mom and dad decorated their Jeep to be Geronimo's Cadillac from the song by Michael Martin Murphey. The kindergarten class led the Jeep and performed dances. Then my dad's 2nd graders were sentry guards wearing masks and shields protecting Geronimo and his wife and his staff who rode in the Jeep. They won a trophy each year, which I think is pretty cool. One of my favorite parts about the parade is that I went right past the mural my parents made for the school one summer as part of the Youth Conservation Corps. My parents have hundreds of stories that they've told me, all as interesting as the last one. But to me, the most fascinating part about their time there was the friendships they made with some of the Navajo Code Talkers. This is Samuel N. So. Sam So was the teacher advisor for the Lukachukai Boarding School and the man who hired my dad and made my parents' experience with the Navajo possible. Not only was he my parents' boss, but he was also their next-door neighbor and lifelong friend. Sam So was a part of the 5th Marine Division during World War II and was a Navajo Code Talker at Sasebo, Nagasaki, and Iwo Jima. My parents were very lucky to become friends with Sam So when they did, because he told them stories about his time during World War II that I wouldn't have been allowed to just 10 years earlier, in 1968, when the Navajo Code Talkers finally became declassified by the U.S. government. Before I go on about Sam So, let me give you some background information about the Navajo Code Talkers. It all started in 1942, when the U.S. decided that the code they would use to transmit messages during war would be of the Navajo language, a language that only a handful of people outside the reservation knew. So, the first 29 recruited Navajos were sent to Camp Elliott in San Diego to develop this incredible code. But what's important to know is that this was a code within a code. They didn't just translate words into Navajo. These 29 men chose their own words for each military term and then translated that into Navajo. They even had multiple terms for letters to avoid repetition. The original code was about 200 words long, and throughout the war it became about 411 terms long. After the code was created, the U.S. Marines drafted over 400 Navajo men into the military to learn the code and transmit messages. Sam So was one of these men. One of the stories he told my parents was how he got drafted into the war at a young age. He had lied to get a job on the railroad. He was 17, but he needed to be 21 to be hired. Back then, you didn't need much proof to get a job, so all he did was say he was 21 and he got hired. But it proved to be the reason he would become a Navajo Code Talker.
While we were working on the railroad, the draft board came around, and they asked all the guys there, "Are you registered?" and stuff like that. When it came to me, and it says, "I'm only 18, I'm not draft age yet." It says, "Baloney. You cannot work on this railroad while you're 18 years old. You have to be 21 or yes." So I just told him, I said, "No problem, I'll go there." Not even, I guess it's not even a month later, the draft board called me and says, "I want you." Uncle Sam wanted me.
And so, Sam So became a part of the U.S. Marines' 5th Division, but not without questioning his rights. What has been glossed over in history is that the Navajo Code Talkers should never have participated in any war, and Sam So knew this.
And I sort of complained when they draft me. And I said, Hey, at the Treaty of 1868 between the federal government and the Navajo tribe. In that treaty, it says, you Navajos will not bear arms anymore. And right there, they shove a rifle in our hands and say, you go defend America. I complained that, but nobody heard me.
As is the case with many Native American treaties with the United States, the Navajo Treaty of 1868 was not upheld. By enlisting the Navajo Code Talkers into the war, the treaty is broken. However, if the Code Talkers weren't created, it's hard to say that the U.S. could have won the war. The Code Talkers created an unbreakable code and delivered it efficiently. They worked in record time. In what could take a soldier several hours, the Code Talkers could translate, transmit, and retranslate a code in a little over 2 minutes. Sam So was one of the Navajo Code Talkers who operated during the invasion of Iwo Jima, where over 800 messages were sent without error. He actually received the message that Mount Suribachi had been taken and looked up and saw the flag being raised. 5th Marine Division Signal Officer Major Howard Connor, who was in charge of the Code Talkers at Iwo Jima, said, "Were it not for the Navajo Code Talkers, the Marines never would have taken Iwo Jima." And as we know from history, Iwo Jima became one of the most famous battles of the war. The photo raising the flag on Iwo Jima has become a testament of United States pride and power. The Code Talkers were used throughout the war. They delivered messages efficiently and seamlessly in extremely stressful and intense situations. They helped the U.S. win the war, but it took years for the U.S. to thank them. The code proved so effective, the U.S. wouldn't declassify it until 1968, 23 years after the war ended. Before that, the Navajo Code Talkers weren't allowed to talk about their effort in the war with anyone, including their family. Even after the code was declassified, it took years for the U.S. to give recognition to them for being Code Talkers. It wasn't until 2001, 56 years after World War II ended, and 19 years after my parents left the reservation, that the United States Congress honored the Code Talkers with gold and silver congressional medals. It took a long time for Navajo Code Talkers to gain the recognition they deserved. They walked in both of President Clinton's inauguration parades. You can see their work in museums, movies, and TV shows. However, it still doesn't seem like enough. The Code Talkers risked their lives for a country that took land away from them. They changed the course of the war. My parents feel honored to have met some of these men. I focused on Sam So because of his close relationship with my family, but they met others too, like John Kinsel Sr. of the 3rd Marine Division. He was the supervisory education technician at the Lukachukai Boarding School, and his daughter was my mom's teaching aide. I feel very blessed to hear these stories from my parents, and I find it important that we continue to tell them. We need to honor the work these men did for our country by listening to their stories and spreading them. As Sam So would often say, and since there's no Navajo word for goodbye, always walk in beauty.